So way back when I first graduated college, I had really big dreams on where my supposed guitar career was going to take me at the time. And like many young players, I had a lot of assumptions on how exactly I was going to get there. I thought a lot of things were necessary that probably weren't. I thought that I needed a Strat with 11s, a Logic Pro subscription, and of course the biggest of which, a tube amp. The type of tube amp that was going to make other players in the room know that I was legit. You see, I had taken care of the first two, but I wasn't necessarily satisfied with the amp portion. I had spent the past year of my life rocking a Fender Super Champ X2 in my college dorm room. A really great little 15-watt amp, but for some heavily insecurity-inspired reasons, I felt like once I got into the real world, I was going to have to upgrade if I ever wanted to keep up. So I did what every bored musician does, and I ended up going to the guitar store to try out some amps. And there was a host of amps that I was looking at the time. There was a Blues Junior. It looked kind of like this. That it definitely caught my eye. Fender had more recently released their Bass Breaker series just a few years earlier, but the one that had both my curiosity and my attention, kind of like Leo, was actually this Marshall. Now, I'd been jamming at my buddy's house for the past couple of years, and his dad had this entire collection of Marshall stacks that we would go through. So I had it in my head that one of the best and fastest ways to getting like professional tone was going through a tube Marshall. Now, I knew that the Marshall stack would probably be unreasonable for someone in a space of my size, but the idea of even owning any sort of tube Marshall combo amp literally made my heart skip a beat. I tried a few of the ones that they had there at the store, but on my camp counselor salary, I was pretty honest about the fact that I probably wasn't going to be able to afford a new one. So I decided to try my luck with the used section, and wouldn't you know, they had just one single amp left in the Marshall category that was right in my price range. It seemed to be around the same size, maybe just a hair larger than the DSL-40, which was the one that I originally had my eyes on. It sounded good, and I felt like it was the tube upgrade that I knew I wanted. The only problem was where I was actually going to get the money before someone else came in and scooped it up. I had spent the majority of my money on a PRS that would eventually cost me thousands just to get rid of, but more on that story on a different day if you want it. Basically, what I'm saying is I was low on cash, but I did have this just one thing that I thought might even the scales. I was coming home from college after the semester had ended, so I basically had everything that I owned, including all of my guitar gear, just sitting there in my trunk, which also included my gold top Les Paul Tribute that I had gotten for Christmas 18 months prior, and that thing was, well, a beast. It looked phenomenal. It sounded great. I mean, it even had these black pickups that helped separate it from pretty much every other Les Paul in that same price range. And for a quick second, I really did think to myself, how much would they actually give me for this? I mean, I like this guitar, but I already have my Strat, and I tend to play that guitar a lot more. So I brought the guitar into the cashier, and I'm like, what would you give me for this? And he says, right around the cost of the amp. And it's at that moment that I made what I now consider to be one of the dumbest decisions of my entire gear-loving career. I traded my Les Paul Tribute for Marshall 40 Haze. Now, I'm not always saying that amp for guitar is the worst trade in the world, but with what that guitar was worth at the time, I think they definitely ripped me off. But I can't change that now in 2025. So I ended up eventually taking that amp home to my first ever apartment post-college by myself. And for a moment, I was really happy. I had guitar, I had tube amp, I was in an apartment all by myself for the first time ever, and I felt like no one could stop me, or at least that's what I thought. Until I very quickly realized the realities of owning a 40-watt Marshall with no attenuator in a 350 square foot apartment in the middle of downtown Philadelphia. If you can't tell simply from the tone of my voice, it was the absolute worst. The amp was way too loud to get any sort of realistic gain staging in that tiny, tiny space. It was always noisy, so there was all this feedback in the apartment that I could not get a hold of. Basically, every part of that Marshall fairy tale that I had had in my head for all those years was a lie. I can't remember if I sold it or returned it, but it was out of my hands within a few short weeks. And I can honestly say that since that day, I've never owned a Marshall. And outside of some very specific Tonex or other digital captures and recreations, anything close. That wasn't until I started to get a little bit curious about a month ago, and curious about these guys right here. Now this right here is an amp pedal. More specifically, it's a digital recreation of a Marshall Super Lead. Now the Super Lead is the type of amp that is so big that up until about 4 months ago when I moved into this space, I never ever would have considered owning. And I wanted to show you, and also the previous version of myself that was like obsessed with owning a Marshall, why depending on your situation, the digital version of the Marshall, or I guess any amp, might actually be better for you. So the first reason why I think digital might be optimal in a lot of scenarios is actually due to gain staging. And for those who don't know what gain staging is, it's basically the process by which you get your optimal gain and levels in order to achieve whatever tone you're trying to get. And one of my earliest mistakes was thinking that was really only important when you're recording, but it's actually a really vital part to getting any tone at all with any amp at all, even the digital ones. And like I was saying with my old Marshall, that may or may not be an impossible task for a lot of people, depending on what kind of room situation you have. And once you start getting into the world of 50 and 100 watt Marshall super leads and plexis, that you know they're never going to put a 5 watt attenuator in. And that rings especially true once you start to get into the world of amps that are labeled as high gain. And I know that technically not every Marshall is a high gain amp, but when you start with the clean thing, and then you go to like the modded brown sound, it starts to make a world of difference. The second reason has a lot to do with the specific piece of hardware in general, and I'm not even just talking about UA pedals here. With a lot of these pedals that are modeled after more specific amp types, it feels like they're much more closely trying to copy the specific layout when it comes to the knob. Like it's more than just having an EQ setting and then tailoring the sound of the pedal as a whole to be Marshall-like, but specifically with something like the Super Lion, having two parallel channels with two specific volume knobs where one sounds like this, and then the other one sounds completely different. And I think that can be a really cool introduction and catalyst into not just how these amps are supposed to sound, but how they're supposed to function as a whole. Another reason why digital is more preferable in a lot of scenarios has to do with recording. Now, before we were talking about the gain staging side, but the other side is actually miking up the amp. And when you start to go in direct and take miking out of the equation, a really big selling point for a lot of people is the convenience factor. But I also must admit that for a lot of people that might be a deal breaker in a different type of way, and that's where it becomes really ambiguous, because you'll get a lot of more of the engineered types who feel like taking away the miking of an amp really takes away from their creativity process in terms of choosing amps and choosing where to mic them. But on the other side, the people who really want the digital recreations might feel like they just want something a little bit higher quality than their Logic stock amps to just plug in and play and be able to twist knobs in the same way. In addition to all of those, I feel like versatility is a really big reason why people might prefer digital alternatives. It's one of those things where even if you're into digital recreations of hyper-specific amps, the amount of possibilities in terms of, say, just the amount of cabs you can pick can make a world of difference. Once you start getting into the world of customizing and uploading your own IRs, a world that I haven't even taken a single step in, it feels like you're playing an entire different ballgame. So at the end of the day, what's even the point of all this? And I don't think it's to tell you that you need a digital amp. You might not. And I also don't think it's to tell you that this guy right here sounds exactly the same as a vintage 68 Super Lead. It's to tell you, and also myself from like give or take 10 years ago, that there are scenarios where I think this or other digital amps might actually be preferable to that, depending on what you need and what scenario you're in. There are different guitar players and they have different needs and they have different rooms and they have different preferences. And I really, really appreciate what a lot of these digital models are able to do for them or myself when I was in an apartment. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. Do you like digital amps? Are you not a fan? Do you only stick to tube amps? What do you think the UA pedals as a whole? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. Ever since I got in this room, it's been a really cool thing to be able to mic up amps again and to really crank them and see what that tone is like. But I think it's also been a really cool thing to be able to revisit these and to be able to do some comparisons and see what the differences and strengths and weaknesses are. So if you want to know anything more about where I got the 68 Superline, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other amps, mics, guitars, pedals I used in these videos. Make sure to check out those links. Thank you so much to all of my patrons. There's some extra exclusive content on there if you want to join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, most important of all, have a fantastic night.